Thank you so much for having me. Today I'll be talking to you about a series of projects that we did related to this topic of online discrimination, with particular attention to the role of white bystanders. So we're really thinking about anti-Black online discrimination that would be perpetuated often by white college students or by white people online in these kind of college student spaces, and then thinking about the role of other white people in terms of responding to that discrimination. I do want to start by acknowledging my collaborators. There was a whole team of us who kind of addressed multiple facets of this project, and also the participants, because obviously the work wouldn't be possible without them. I also want to acknowledge my research lab, which includes a lot of graduate students and undergraduate students. You can see them here in these photos. We are the Promoting Healthy Adolescent Development Lab, or the FAD Lab. The William T. Grant Foundation actually funded this project that I'm going to present to you today, and then I want to thank the James Weldon Johnson Institute and all of you for attending and inviting me here. So just to give you an overview so you understand kind of the scope of what I'll be covering today, these are a series of questions. It is a three-part project, so the first element I'll talk to you about was an online data scrape of two different online spaces that we thought were tied to the campus community. We also did a series of focus groups separately with Black students, with Black graduate students who facilitated those meetings, and then with white students, with white graduate students who facilitated those meetings, and I'll be sharing with you some of the takeaways from that research. And then we will also talk a little bit today about a brief online intervention study that we did, so kind of like a social psychological experiment that we did with about 400 white undergraduate students. And so you have a sense here that these are the questions that were kind of guiding the project. Just to give you a little bit of background, we do know, and many of you may be familiar with these statistics, we have seen an increase in college going among Black youth. So we are seeing higher enrollment, but we have seen over the past decade actually a growing gap between Black and white students in terms of college completion. And while a lot of attention has been paid to kind of academic preparedness and the idea that maybe Black and white students are not coming into the college environment with the same access to resources or kind of having the same level of training, increasingly we're getting a better sense that that may be a factor, but that these marginalizing experiences that students are having at the same institution as their white peers may be a bigger driver of that Black-white college completion gap. We do know that of all racial and ethnic groups, Black students are the least satisfied with their campus racial climate. Again, we're focusing here at predominantly white institutions, so the study is not attending to Black students' experiences at HBCUs, for example. And we also know from a growing number of studies in psychology and in education that Black students are encountering racial discrimination with relative frequency at predominantly white institutions. And as many of you are aware, college students, just like the rest of us, are increasingly spending more and more of our social interaction time online. In this set of projects, we really conceptualized the comment section and kind of Facebook and these social media platforms as virtual social spaces. So we were really thinking about how students are engaging with other students in these online spaces. And really, some of our work and the work of others suggests that a majority of Black and white students think that those online spaces are contributing to the campus racial climate. So we do have some evidence to bolster the idea that these virtual spaces are seen as kind of social spaces where students are engaging with each other. And what you'll see as I talk more about some of our findings, but previous research has also suggested that this discrimination that students are experiencing and that a lot of what they're reporting in terms of the discriminatory experiences they're having are in these online spaces, and that in a variety of different ways, even just from like distraction to internalized kind of racist views, that these are experiences that might actually be undermining students' ability to perform academically. All right, so the first part of this project that I'll share with you was a 3-month surveillance. So we identified groups, Facebook groups that were related to the campus, either student groups or campus-based organizations. And then we also looked at the online student newspaper comments section. We pulled all of the posts from September 1 of 2017 until November 30th of 2017. We scraped the data using Python and R, and I'll show you on the next slide some of the keywords that we used. And then there was a team of 3 of us who analyzed. So for the comment section, we pulled all, there were fewer than 1,000 comments during that 3-month time period, so we just went ahead and analyzed all of those. For Facebook, there were closer to 10,000, so we just pulled the posts that had at least one of the keywords that I'll show you on the next slide. Here were the keywords that we used, and then we analyzed that led to about 1,000 posts that had at least one of these words, and that's how we analyzed that data to see what was coming up. We were really just trying to characterize the online terrain. So here's some of the findings we have from that work. The different categories that we came up with. I'll also just note that we did attempt to use like a machine learning approach at first. So we thought, it's a lot of content to go through. It would have been nice if there was just a way to kind of train the program to be able to pull and kind of categorize for us. A really interesting finding from this work, as being one of the people who was kind of going through all of these comments, was the extent to which language, social justice language, really gets co-opted to engage in kind of racist rhetoric. So many of you might be familiar with the ways in which white nationalists have talked about white genocide and kind of use these other claims that white men in particular, are victims and are being attacked. And so it has been really interesting doing this work to see that a number of the kind of white supremacist and racist remarks that were being made were using language that would overlap with kind of social justice related comments. So again, the need for us to kind of go through this as a team of 3 human coders became increasingly clear that there wasn't going to be a kind of machine learning approach that we'd be able to use. So that's one of, there isn't a lot of research that has attempted to do this yet. And I think one of our contributions of this project is indicating that, this may continue to require a human coder element, just because we don't want to falsely categorize some of the posts. So you'll see here, one of the categories we had was explicitly anti-Black. So that would be specifically naming a Black group or Black people, African Americans, indicating something specifically about Black people being inferior, pro-slavery ideas. Anti-inclusivity was broader than that, so that included remarks that would have been against any kind of racial ethnic minority group, against different religious groups, Muslims, Jews. It would also include anti-LGBTQ remarks. So you see here a few examples for each of these. We also had another category. I want to just point out that these were not mutually exclusive, so we do have some overlap here. In particular, over half of the political comments were also anti-inclusivity comments. So we were seeing a lot of overlap there. A lot of the political remarks were kind of like anti-left, anti-liberal, anti-democrat. And then we did see more challenges in the Facebook subset, but again, we identified groups on Facebook affiliated with the university who we thought would be more likely to be posting things that were race-related. So I think part of that is that a number of those groups were like, a Black Student Union group, for example. So we would have seen that the initial posts that were being made were much more likely to be pro-inclusivity, and then we would also see that then the engagement with comments that were racist or discriminatory was more likely to be a challenge. We were not seeing that as much in the student newspaper comments. Then we had pro-inclusivity comments, which did not have to be in response to a discriminatory remark. So the challenge we looked at threaded content, so the challenge had to be in response to a racist post in order for us to categorize it as a challenge. Pro-inclusivity would just be a post that was made, didn't have to be in response to something discriminatory, that was just expressing some kind of desire for inclusion and diversity, or celebrating that within the community. And then a much smaller percentage, and I think also just to note that these are moderated spaces, and so these the less than 20 posts that we found that were aggressive or hostile were actually like violating the restrictions that these moderation panels express for what's allowable content. So presumably these are posts that haven't yet been taken down or haven't been reported. To move on to the focus groups, as I mentioned briefly at the outset, we did a total of 8 focus groups, and we had 68 students in total. Students were, again, these were racially separate groups, and we advertised and kind of recruited for this study by saying, we will be talking about anti-Black online discrimination. For white students, we said, we're inviting you to come to do this with other white students, and for Black students, we said with other Black students, just knowing that students would be more comfortable and more likely to be honest in terms of expressing their experiences with the same race group set of peers. We did have students, we wanted them to be at least in their second year of study, because we felt like students in their first year of study may not have had as many experiences to be able to reference. And we did have a wide range of majors in our groups. We did kind of stratify in our recruitment to make sure that we would have pretty even distribution of men and women. We did ask, these were about 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minute sessions. So I'm just gonna present some of those findings for you today. Some of the questions we asked were distinct by race. So with the Black students, we were much more interested in understanding how they felt affected by online discrimination. We asked both groups to tell us more about what they saw, what they would consider to be online discrimination, because if our ultimate goal is to have a white bystander intervention, we know that white students would first have to perceive the content as discriminatory before they would be able to respond. So the next slide, I'll talk to you about where there was consensus around that. We did ask also Black and white students how they felt about it, because we were also trying to understand for white students whether they think it's a problem and what they think their role is in terms of responding to it. So we have some overlap there. For Black students, we asked additional questions about how online discrimination might relate, for example, to their sense of belonging at the institution. And for white students, we asked a number of additional questions just related to whether they had ever challenged, what factors might prevent them from challenging, what factors might facilitate challenging. Again, we had a team of 3, multiracial team of 3, and we included thematic analyses as our primary approach. Those analyses were guided by our overarching research questions, so this wasn't just like a completely grounded theory, kind of open exploration. We did have specific questions that were guiding what we were investigating, and then we used a consensual qualitative research approach. So we had a series of meetings to build. We didn't actually have a lot of disagreement in our initial pass at the coding, but when there was disagreement, we had a series of meetings to kind of come to consensus about how we were coding that data. All right, so in terms of what we were seeing, I'm gonna go ahead and put the first 3 themes or codes up here, because these were, I think, also all related to kind of an overarching idea around police brutality. So what we were seeing, and this was, again, consensus, so Black students and white students were both reporting separately in these groups and across all of the different focus groups, that when we asked them to describe some of the online discrimination that they had encountered, they were talking about seeing these hashtag Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, particularly in response to Black Lives Matter posts. And for those of you who are not familiar, which I would hope is not anyone in this room, addressing police brutality was a primary thrust of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so trying to think about why there needs to be this kind of counter and kind of shifting that attention away from police brutality and kind of the attack on Black bodies to focus on a kind of like an all lives matter or blue lives matter to center kind of police in that narrative was something that both Black and white students were saying that they felt was problematic. And then another thing, and I'll show you some of their own words on the next slide, but students had talked about seeing white students justifying police brutality by saying that Black people were more violent or Black people were just engaging in activities that warranted that kind of response. So again, it was kind of a way to delegitimize social justice and racial justice efforts around Black Lives Matter. And similarly with Colin Kaepernick, who was, taking a knee during the national anthem and protesting against police brutality. So the idea that there was a lot of critique of him and kind of trying to recenter that story to be about being anti-patriotic as opposed to actually acknowledging the veracity of the claims that he was making about police brutality. And so you see some examples here. We also did have, this was in 2017, 2018 that we did all of this data collection. And so unsurprisingly, there were a number of students who were talking about white students who were posting content from Trump. And not just links or quotes or liking his own tweets, but also adding on like that they endorsed or kind of agreed with some of those expressions. And then this relates to kind of what I was saying earlier. Students talked about this just stating the facts as a type of racism that they encountered online, where people would say, I'm not racist, but it's just a fact that Black people are less intelligent, Black people are more violent. So this way of trying to kind of situate oneself as not being, a hate-filled, bigoted person, but just being a logical and kind of objective person who just sees the numbers, which obviously those are not correct numbers anyway. So this is like a lot of misinformation, but masquerading as kind of like objectivity. And then also we did have students, both Black and white students, talk about explicit racism, that they were, now this was like to a lesser degree than some of these other categories, but students across these groups still said that they were seeing that. So for example, a few years ago, there was an incident where a Black student at the institution had been brutalized by police, by like a liquor enforcement team of officers, and Black students were protesting in the library in response to that. And there were people posting on social media, get the monkeys out of library. There was another post, something about why is all the farm equipment in the library? So again, like clearly very explicitly racist, like no need to kind of read between the lines in any of that. All right, so here I'll show you in their own words some of the things that students were saying in these focus groups. One white female said around the All Lives Matter and with the police violence and stuff, that they're like, Black people are bringing it on themselves, like the police aren't responsible, like all this stuff. We need to support our police. A Black male said, and normally about the first 5 or 6 responses to the tweet is always someone talking about, oh, the Black people deserved it. Oh, yeah, they shouldn't have been in this area. They shouldn't have been holding this phone or whatever. That looked like a gun or something. A white male said Colin Kaepernick, and he was like, given his background, he should just be happy to have a job. So he's saying that he's seeing these kinds of posts where people are saying Colin Kaepernick should just like be quiet and stop engaging in this kind of anti-patriotic protest. And another Black male said, I would agree with that, especially after the shithole countries thing. The amount of, well, they are that I saw was insane. So that's kind of the example of just endorsing or kind of co-signing these very racist comments that Trump has made. All right, in terms of consequences for Black students, unsurprisingly, we got an overwhelming negative response that students were feeling affected. I think especially as we thought about students in their 3rd and 4th year, they were talking about this kind of cumulative effect of having to, just being exhausted and being tired of having to engage with this on a fairly regular basis. Unfortunately, some students did talk about kind of an internalized racist view. So they're saying like, I didn't really have this experience before I came here, but I've been kind of inundated with this in these online spaces since I've been here, and so it has actually made me to kind of question myself a little bit, which, was I think even surprising to them. we definitely saw students talking about this undermining their sense of belonging at the institution. I'll show you some of their quotes in just a moment here on the next slide. And also just fostering more negative perceptions of white students. So these were some examples where they said, and again, why we're looking at this broader study, we're thinking about a white bystander intervention, because Black students were saying, when I see these posts and they are either like supported, liked, there's agreement with them, or if I just see them and I don't see a single challenge, nobody is engaging with that, saying like, that's a really problematic thing you said, I disagree with you, or like, don't say that, then they feel like that indicates broader endorsement, that all white students and even maybe professors at the institution feel that way. They also talked about, again, related to the sense of belonging, this sense that the school isn't really theirs, that they actually don't belong there, that this is the space that's not for them, and that they aren't entitled to the same experiences that their white peers are. And they also talked about it just kind of reminding them of their otherness. So they're already not seeing many other Black students in the classroom, not very many Black professors teaching their classes or even TAing their classes. And so then when you have on top of it expressions of beliefs that Black people are inferior or somehow don't belong there, they were talking about kind of a compounding effect. Some students did say that they felt motivated to work harder to kind of prove, white supremacists wrong. And in another set of projects that we're doing, I just want to be careful that we're not attributing that to, or we're not kind of interpreting that as being a positive thing, just because there is research to suggest that sustained high effort coping actually does take not just a mental health toll, but a physical health toll. So I don't think that's necessarily a good finding, even though these students might still persist and do well academically and even graduate. There may be these other kind of physical and mental health tolls that's taking. Students talked about additional stress related to failing and just what the consequences would be for all Black students. So, if you really just kind of think about that as being an additional stressor, we now have a compounded set of stressors that are undermining probably cognitive functioning, and obviously distracting, in that they're taking up all of this mental energy. And unfortunately, students also talked about not utilizing the resources that are there that are available for all students, such as office hours, and this idea that by asking questions in class or going to office hours, they would be confirming those beliefs about Black inferiority, that they don't in fact belong there. And then we also had some students talk about just like feeling this pressure to show up. So again, I think we should all be advocating for social justice, and we should all be, even from just a moral stance, wanting all of our students to feel safe and to be able to kind of maximize their potential in these institutions of higher education. But when this responsibility and burden falls disproportionately on the people who are marginalized and harmed by it, you have students who are also feeling now like, I'm already overwhelmed, I'm distracted, I'm exhausted, and I should be studying for this test, but now I feel like I need to go to this event, to this demonstration, because if not, then this institution isn't going to change. So here's a perfect quote that's illustrating that. A Black male said, "I was gonna say it takes up a lot of mental space. I think during the election I was trying to study, and I found myself thinking through a conversation I'd had with people, especially arguments on Facebook, and I should be studying. I should be putting all my attention there. But I feel like I'm wasting a lot of time dealing with these emotions of racially charged posts and people who are aggressive. I feel like it kind of affected my performance because it was just wasting my time." Another Black male said, "It just makes me feel stupid, like inadequate. Like one, it's like I don't belong here. And then if I'm struggling, it's like I'm struggling because I don't belong here." So you can see how this can kind of feel like a vicious cycle for some of the students. And one Black female said, "Yeah, I find myself not asking for help in white-dominated classes because I just feel like, oh, then their opinions of me are right." All right, so then moving to the rationale for the broader project of why do we think that white bystanders should play more of a role in this? I mean, one, related to the point I was just making, the idea that this is a white people problem. So the idea that Black students should be the ones to solve it, who are actually the ones who are being victimized by it, I think just more generally is a problematic stance. So the idea that we all of us should share the responsibility for the racial climate at our institutions, and that shouldn't fall disproportionately on any group, but if it does, it especially shouldn't fall disproportionately on the group who's most harmed by it. There's also research, though, to suggest that, and our own included, that for Black students, it actually makes a difference to see white students challenging. So we had Black students saying, when I see even one white person engaged to challenge what a racist, a post that a white person has made that is racist, it makes me then feel like maybe not all of the white people here feel that way, right? So it helps me to kind of shift and change. I'll show you in a minute, a lot white students were much more likely in the focus groups to say, that's probably just some troll. It's not somebody who's worth taking seriously. It's better to just ignore. And not really understanding that for Black students, it was not as easy to just kind of dismiss or write it off as like some outlier. It was more, the tendency was more to interpret that as being just any white student, maybe the one who sits next to them in their chemistry class. And also to think that if nobody is challenging, like if no one is responding, then that's a shared view. So I think that was another important concern. And we saw that distinction between the Black students and white students in terms of how they were interpreting those posts in the first place. And then there's also research to show that when white students or white individuals more generally, even in work settings, confront their white peers, the individual who made the racist comment is more receptive. When a Black or a person of color is the one who challenges, then white people are more likely to dismiss that challenge and to think of it as complaining or whining. When a white person challenges them, they're more receptive to that feedback. Okay, so as I was just mentioning, we were trying to understand what some of the barriers were specifically for white students. So we asked white students if they had ever challenged, and overwhelmingly they had not. And so when we were trying to ask, like, have you ever wanted to but didn't, kind of what got in the way, and this idea of like not, I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, like don't feed the trolls, but just this idea that, people are trolling to try and get a reaction out of you, and the best thing to do is to just ignore them. And this again was like just a fundamental difference in how Black students and white students were interpreting and responding to these racist comments that were being made. And then a lot of white students were also afraid that if they engaged with the person who was posting something racist, that they would appear, it's kind of like an online impression management thing, where they were worried that they would come across as angry or hostile, that it would end up being this like extended back and forth. It would escalate to personal attacks. And they were really kind of nervous about that. They were kind of risk averse. Another thing that they said was, someone who is bold enough to kind of make that post online is likely not going to be receptive to what I have to say. So I'm not going to be able to change their minds. And if I can't change their minds, then why should I do it? And then some students said, I just don't know what to say. Like, I don't know if it's my place to say something. I don't know what I should say. I don't know how to kind of approach that. So then, we've had students even say that they typed out a response, but then instead of like submitting it, they just screenshotted it and sent it to like a group text because they felt like they wanted to respond, but they were really nervous that they would have like said the wrong thing and that then they would be in this online space for everyone to see. So again, kind of some risk aversion there. In terms of factors that would help them to be more confident and able to challenge, and again, this is kind of related to the previous slide. So students said if they really understood, and I guess in a couple instances when it had been a Black friend, and they had been really able to understand, like, I'm connected to that person and that person is being like attacked or harmed, that was a motivator for them intervening. So you'll see when we get to the online experiment, we thought making that explicit connection to their Black peers at their university could be a way to kind of build that, strengthen that connection between them and really understanding that someone like them, someone who they saw as somewhat similar to them, was being harmed by that post. And it wasn't just some, troll that everybody could ignore. Also, if it was clear to them that the challenge would be of benefit, right? So I think they were saying, I'm not sure if I should do this. Is it even my place? Will people even kind of appreciate that, or will it just be seen as me like kind of stepping out of turn? And then related to social norms, and this is, again, related to what I said on the previous slide, but shifting the objective. So if white students were saying the point of challenging is to change a racist person's mind, and that seems like a task that I'm never going to be effective at because that's an impossible task, shifting it to say the challenge is not about changing the troll's mind. There's a whole psychology of trolling. That's a whole different type of intervention. This is not an intervention to get people who are trying to go online to hurt people to do that less. This is an intervention to say, if you as one white person see that and respond to that, it's not because you're trying to change the person's life who posted it. It's because you're actually changing that online space. You're changing the racial climate at your institution. And Black students and other students of color and other students who just value racial justice will appreciate that. Related to social norms, too, they also said, that sense of shared responsibility, that we are all responsible for that's not just up to the people who are being targeted to then respond or engage with. And also that if more people were doing it, it would be easier. So I think the bigger picture here is that we feel if we're able to even get a reasonable number of students, but not necessarily the majority, to be willing to engage, that will start to change what the norms are for that online space, and that more students will be likely to challenge, and that other people may be more deterred from posting racist content in the first place. We, again, a little bit separately, asked Black students what advice they would give to white students who wanted to challenge online discrimination. Because again, we want to make sure, if the ultimate goal here is to have the posts engage in a way that benefits Black students and the broader racial climate at the institution, then we want to hear from Black students what kinds of posts they feel would actually make them feel more positively about the racial climate and their sense of belonging at the institution. So we asked them, what would they like to see? Had they ever seen this go well? If they had any ideas or advice that they would share. So they did say they wanted to see a clear expression of disagreement. They also said they would appreciate it if white people did express that they were actually emotionally affected by it, that they felt like this was something that was maybe like disappointing to them to see that someone they knew or another student would respond to someone or would attack someone in that way. Interestingly, Black students said that they didn't want to see white students engage in like personal attacks or some extended back and forth. So remember, that was a big concern for white students, was that they were going to be expected to kind of engage in this series of exchanges, and that it was going to get really ugly. And Black students were saying, there's no reason, I don't want that. I don't even desire that. So like, really, I just want to see someone say that they don't agree. I'm fine with them being civil and respectful. I don't need this to escalate into anything where there's like personal attacks. But it would be nice if white people showed that they were affected by it, that they didn't agree with it, and if they're able to like educate, providing facts or instruction. So I'll be happy to talk. That's not a piece, that fourth piece we didn't really tackle in this study, but it is one that some other researchers are starting to contend with, and I have lots of kind of thoughts about that. So I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you have questions. All right, so then moving on to this online experiment, which really was informed, I'll talk about the theories that kind of informed it as well, but we did take a lot from our data scrape and our focus groups to also inform the intervention that we developed. So the theories that we used were the theory of planned behavior. I don't know if any of you have like a public health background, but also from psychological research, there's this confronting prejudice responses model, and these two actually overlap quite a bit. So I'll just show you here kind of the takeaways from those two models. So the first element is around kind of legitimacy. This is true for both, that we're going to actually shift, if the behavior that we're trying to change is white students' willingness to confront online discrimination, then the first element is to convince white students that these virtual spaces are legitimate and that this online racial discrimination actually poses a threat to their Black peers. So kind of really understanding that it's not something they should just ignore or that it's inconsequential, which many white students were saying, but it is actually a legitimate threat. And it does require a response. And that also, if we communicate these strong social norms, that responsibility for engaging is one that white students share. And so kind of changing the way that they're perceiving the norms about who is supposed to do that work. And then lastly, building their self-efficacy. So that was related to the point I made that students were saying, I just don't really know what to say, or I'm worried I'll say the wrong thing. And so I'll show you here the actual content. So we just did a brief online news article, and then if you have questions, we just submitted a grant a couple months ago, so we're really trying to build up. This was kind of more of a proof of concept study, so we're hoping to really be able to expand on some of this. Quickly here, it's about 400 students. We just used a participant pool for students who were enrolled. They weren't psychology majors, they just had to be enrolled in one of the intro-level psych courses. And then we had 3 conditions. So in addition to the control, our partial intervention, I'll show you in a minute, was just one paragraph from this news article that really focused on the legitimacy and social norms. And in the full intervention, they got that piece, but they also got an additional paragraph that was meant to really target the self-efficacy. So really giving instructions about how to challenge and then providing scripts for what that could look like. And then we measured those 3 kind of mediators or mechanisms to see if that was in fact the way that change was happening. And then we gave them, the outcome was whether or not they would actually respond to a racist post. So just so you can see, that's what the article looked like that they saw, but this is the content. So I just wanted to show you and kind of highlight the pieces that were specific to the legitimacy and the social norms. So in the partial intervention, they just saw this, but you can see here that we were trying to really show them that Black students are harmed when they see racially offensive posts or comments. Racially offensive posts or comments, even the subtle ones, make Black students feel unsafe and out of place. One thing that seems to reduce harm to Black students is when white students publicly challenge racially offensive posts or comments online. White students who challenge racially offensive posts or comments online show support to Black students and do their part to improve the racial climate. So again, we're kind of signaling that social responsibility, those shared norms. And then challenging racially offensive posts and comments online is important because even if it doesn't change the person's mind, it changes the racial climate at the university for the better. It means a lot to Black students when they see white students standing up for what's right. By doing so, the university becomes a better place for all. So this was the only thing the partial intervention group saw, but in the full intervention, they also saw the second part, which was the instruction. So you see here, some white students are not sure what to say, but research shows that just expressing disagreement and one's own emotional reaction or personal values is sufficient. Short responses are effective. There's no need to engage in multiple exchanges. And then here are some examples even. I think what you said is harmful to other students. I want this university to be a place where everyone feels welcome. Or I'm disappointed that you would say something that is racially offensive. I'm upset by what you said. I think it's important that all people are treated fairly. Or your comments are racially insensitive and I completely disagree with you. So just that short and simple. And that, again, was directly from the focus groups we did with Black students in terms of what they would like to see. So then here's an example. This was a racist post that we pulled from the online student newspaper. Obviously, we didn't put an identifier, but we showed them, just as they would see, an article actually that didn't have anything to do with race, and that was kind of commonly found in our analysis of the scraped data, that the original article oftentimes didn't have anything to do with race or diversity or inclusivity, and so students or individuals would still find a way to kind of post something racist in that space. So we showed them the article, we showed them this post, and then we asked them if they would like to respond. And if they said that they would, then they were prompted again to another screen where they were able to write an open response entry, or at that point able to opt out. So we still did have a number of students who opted out. They had said first I would, but then didn't actually want to write a response and change their mind. And then we asked them if they would like us to submit their response to the student newspaper. So we felt like that was our true litmus test, because even at that point, students who had submitted a response decided that they didn't want, we did not post them, but we just wanted to make sure that we were truly capturing possible behavior change if students were actually going to be willing to post their response online. We saw for both, so again, students were randomly assigned to control, partial intervention, or full intervention. So in the partial intervention and full intervention compared to the control group, we saw that attitudes and perceived social norms and supportive challenging were higher in both of those groups. So that's what we expected, because that first paragraph included both manipulations meant to target attitudes and social norms. We did see, though, that self-efficacy was only greater in the full intervention relative to control. So the partial intervention, because it didn't include that element of giving instructions about how to confront, unsurprisingly, didn't show any movement on that. So then ultimately, we saw the primary difference in terms of those who were willing to have their response submitted between the full intervention and control. That was the only statistically significant difference. And to give you just a sense of effect sizes. And remember at the outset, I said it's not that we're trying to get 100% of white students to confront. So we really are kind of thinking more about critical mass. And even if we just had enough people challenging as we did who were posting racist content, that possibly could be sufficient given what we said about the expectation that that could change the social norms of those online spaces. So we saw some movement with partial intervention, but not enough for that to be statistically significant. And just looking at the mechanisms, we found that the assignment to intervention condition was related to the actual confronting behavior through self-efficacy. So that does seem to be a very necessary component. Now, maybe, we're working to kind of refine and build this. I guess maybe I have a future directions slide. Yeah. We're working to refine and develop this intervention, and we're looking at other ways to kind of target the legitimacy and the social norms, like using video recordings of Black and white students, kind of providing more narrative. So we're trying to think about ways to kind of build and strengthen that. But we also want to we're working to develop an app that would give white students a chance to do more practicing with the confronting. So really this was proof of concept, but we want to think about each of those elements and how we might be able to strengthen them. And then we also need to do a specific study with a larger number of Black students just to make sure that they do experience a change in kind of sense of belonging when they see a racist post coupled with a confrontation as opposed to just a racist post on its own. And then the other steps that we're working on would be to do this across 4 different institutions they're all predominantly white institutions, but geographically diverse. And then we want to get students, as part of the study, their online handles or kind of identifiers, so that we can then follow them for a 3-month period after exposure to the intervention to see if it actually is changing their online behavior. So beyond just what we were able to see in this one smaller study, we want to see if this kind of generalizes. All right, so that's all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have at this time.